We will now consider H.R. 1665 to ensure the Administrator of FEMA considers severe local impact in making a recommendation to the President for major disaster declaration. I ask unanimous consent to discharge the Economic Development Subcommittee and call up H.R. 1665, and that be considered as read and open amendment at any point. Is there an objection? Without objection, so ordered. I want to commend Representative Davis and Bustos for their bipartisan work on this bill. We have seen cases of neighboring communities in different states, but with virtually identical disaster damage treated differently. This bill will help address this issue for those communities. I recognize Subcommittee Chairman Barletta to explain the bill.
H.R. 1665 will ensure that in making a recommendation to the President for a major disaster declaration, the Administrator of FEMA looks at the intensity of the impact in a localized area. I want to thank my colleague, Mr. Davis, for introducing this legislation and working so closely with the subcommittee on this issue. Unfortunately, his state of Illinois has seen entire communities wiped off the map by a tornado and not qualify for disaster assistance. All too often, we find that rural areas far removed from population centers of a state are not on a level playing field when it comes to disaster assistance. This bill helps ensure the impact to these communities receive due consideration and they get the help they need when disaster strikes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. Now recognize Ranking Member Johnson for a statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I commend the authors of this bill, and I support H.R. 1665 to ensure that severe local impacts are afforded greater weight by FEMA when making disaster declaration recommendations to the President. The Stafford Act prohibits the denial of disaster assistance to a state or local community solely based on a mathematical formula based on income or population. This legislation will prevent that from happening. I urge my colleagues to support the matter, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Now recognize Mr. Davis for a statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Chairman Barletta and Ranking Member Johnson, for your supportive comments. If you ask my constituents their opinion about FEMA's disaster declaration process, they will tell you that it's broken. You don't need to look any further than the state of Illinois to see how FEMA's public assistance formula is failing the hardworking families of this country, because it simply does not put all communities on a level playing field. In 2012, Harrisburg in southern Illinois was denied federal assistance following tornadoes that swept across the Midwest, while Missouri and Kentucky received it just a few short years ago. Just a few short years ago, towns like Gifford and Washington in central Illinois were initially denied too. And last year, Illinois was once again denied public assistance following extensive damage done in late December of 2015 and early January of 2016 caused by severe storms and flooding in the central and southern portions of our state. FEMA currently takes into account several factors when determining the need for public and individual assistance. However, there is currently no standard to determine which factor is more important than another, which leads to a highly subjective and uncertain process that leaves states and communities in limbo for weeks as their application is considered. By working with the Transportation Committee last year, when we marked up H.R. 1471, the FEMA Disaster Assistance Reform Act, we were successful in including important language based on my bill that requires the administrator of FEMA, when making recommendations to the President regarding a disaster declaration, to give greater weight and consideration to severe local impact. H.R. 1471 ultimately passed out of the House under suspension last Congress, but unfortunately, the bill did not move in the Senate. This Congress, I've introduced this language, along with my friend from Illinois, Mrs. Bustos, as the Disaster Declaration Improvement Act. Passing this bill will have a real impact in states like Illinois, where a large portion of the population is concentrated in a small geographical area. Because of the population density in the northern part of my home state, rural parts of the state, much of my district, must meet an arbitrarily high threshold in order to qualify for a disaster declaration. Enacting this language into law will help level the playing field and help ensure rural areas are given a fair shake when disaster happens and when help is needed. It's just not right that states like Illinois, where a significant portion of the population is concentrated in a single area, can potentially be denied disaster relief because of an arbitrary formula developed by bureaucrats in concrete buildings here in Washington, D.C. That's what makes passing this bill so important. Again, I'd like to express my personal gratitude to Chairman Schuster and Subcommittee Chairman Barletta, Ranking Member Johnson, and their staff for working with me to ensure we move this bill in early in the 115th Congress. And again, I would like to thank my colleague from Illinois, my friend, who has been with me in this process since the beginning and last year helping to develop language, for her efforts. And Ms. Bustos, thank you again. And I urge a yes vote, and I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. With that, I recognize Ms. Bustos for a statement.
Thank you, Chairman Schuster. And I also want to thank my colleague from Illinois and my friend, Congressman Davis, especially for your bipartisan work, not just on this issue, but on so many other issues as well. We have been working together to try to bring fairness to the FEMA disaster declaration process going back to 2014. And that was at a time when a tornado devastated the town of Pekin, East Peoria, and Washington, Illinois. Despite a tremendous amount of damage, what happened was, as Congressman Davis said, FEMA denied Illinois' request for disaster recovery assistance because of this formula that puts smaller communities at a disadvantage in a state that has a major population center, as we do in Illinois with the city of Chicago. Far too many small towns in downstate Illinois have faced similar issues, so I hope we can finally bring fairness to the disaster relief process. And with that, I ask my colleagues to support this effort, and I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady. With that, do any other members wish to be heard? We will now consider the bill for amendment.
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Graves is recognized for
I have an amendment.
the amendment at the desk.
The amendment is at the desk.
Mr. Chairman, I want to thank the gentleman and the gentlewoman from Illinois for introducing this legislation. I think it is exactly what needs to be happening. We have also found arbitrary approaches to disaster declarations in the state of Louisiana. One thing that we've had in particular over the last year is we've had multiple successive disasters in the same regions, and FEMA has, rather than looking at them cumulatively, has isolated the disasters and not recognized the cumulative impacts that perhaps a tornado, a flood, or other types of natural disasters that have occurred in the same area. And so we have an amendment, and all it would do is it would add the term on page 2, line 2, or recent multiple disasters. And so instead of just looking at the local impacts, it would look also at recent multiple disasters in an area. And I urge adoption of the amendment.
Thank the gentleman. Any members wish to be heard on the amendment?
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Davis recognized.
although it personally pains me, I would like to thank the gentleman from Louisiana because I think his amendment is a very good amendment, and I support it. I agree this is going to improve the bill, as Illinois has seen where multiple storms or flooding events can hit the same area in a short period of time, and how that cumulative effect can have a significant impact on the ability of those communities to recover and rebuild. I appreciate Mr. Graves working with my office and the committee on this amendment to our amendment, and I again thank him for his efforts, and I urge the adoption.
Any other members wish to be heard? Seeing none, there are other amendments to the amendments. Seeing none, if the question is on the amendment, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to.